Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When the long-closed Kingsbridge Armory was finally poised last year to be developed as a $310 million retail center with as many as 1,200 permanent jobs, the developer was stopped in his tracks by the insistence of local elected officials that he require tenants in the project to pay their workers what is called a living wage. In the current city climate, that means workers would have to be paid at least $10 an hour plus benefits, or $11.50 an hour without benefits, above the current minimum wage of $7.75 an hour. The developer said no. The Kingsbridge Armory, a hulking 575,000 square foot red brick castle in the West Bronx, remains empty as it has been since 1994. Larger economic forces are in play in this debate, which has recurred throughout American history at times of recession and high unemployment. The questions posed to decision makers and by extension to the city at large are whether any job is better than no job, or if there is civic, even moral obligation to use the power of government to mandate that businesses pay wages and benefits that allow their employees to gain a foothold on the bottom rung of a ladder that presumably climbs towards the elusive goal of the American dream. In virtually all major developments in the city, as in the case of Kingsbridge Armory, there is the additional factor that taxpayers make a significant investment in the development, whether in the form of tax breaks, direct subsidies, or other forms of allowances for job creation. Does the government have the right? Does it have an obligation to attach strings requiring the payment of a living wage for projects which get significant public support? What is the public benefit when companies such as Walmart that want to open big box stores in New York City pay wages so low that their employees qualify for food stamps and other public benefits that taxpayers also have to fund? And are those strings in the forms of living wage requirements, in fact, perpetuating a cycle of unemployment that presumably serves no social purpose at all? The City Council is now entering into a debate on a proposal that would add a living wage provision to publicly subsidized developments, and we are joined by 4 New Yorkers involved in that debate. Melissa Mark-Viverito is a city councilwoman representing East Harlem, parts of the Bronx, and the west side of Manhattan, who is a sponsor of the council's proposal. Jeff Eichler is the organizing director for the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union that strongly supports the proposal. Fred Siegel is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor at the City Journal, and a critic of living wage mandates. And Stephanie Luce is a professor at the Joseph S. Murphy Institute for Worker Education and Labor Studies at Queens College, who has written about living wage bills around the country. Melissa, I'm going to start with you. Tell me a little bit about the proposal before the City Council and what you expect to happen.
Well, I think you just laid it out very well in your opening that the living wage bill, which is sponsored by my colleagues Annabel Palma and Oliver Coppell, pretty much lays out that whenever there is any economic development project that is receiving some level of public subsidy, that project needs to provide a living wage, which is what you laid out, $10 an hour and $11.50.
What is the minimum wage? Did I get the minimum wage right?
It's $7.25.
I apologize. I heard myself. And
in this case, in the legislation, we're putting it as $10 an hour. That includes benefits, if it includes benefits, and $11.50 if the job does not provide benefits. So that's the way it's laid out in the legislation. I think that kind of somewhat is coupled also with legislation that I sponsor, which is on the prevailing wage end, which provides a prevailing wage to building workers. And I think what, in essence, we're doing is really saying that as legislators in the city of New York, we do have a moral responsibility of really of investing wisely our public monies and our dollars. And so we can't have a two-tiered system where there's certain expectations for corporations and then expectations for everyone else. So I do believe, and we do believe through this legislation, and the council, has about 26 sponsors at the moment. It's a strong support of that concept that if we are investing public monies, therefore developers are obligated to give something back. And in this case, we're talking about a job which, in this day and age, $10 is really not a lot in the city of New York, but at minimum $10 an hour, so that families can at least provide, individuals can provide for their families.
Fred, for a long time we rode the back of Wall Street. We're not riding the back of Wall Street anymore, and I suspect that we will be going more towards a service, that we are moving more towards a service, a retail economy. Is this eating our seed corn, or do these kinds of bills do these kinds of bills, the kind of bill that Melissa's talking about, make sense?
I'm not sure I'd frame it that way, Bob. I just want to add one thing. I'm also a scholar in residence at St. Francis College in Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn.
Wall Street's profits between 1982 and 2007 were extraordinary. Wall Street profits as a percentage of GDP went from 7% of the national economy to 23%. We're never going to see that again. Everyone in the city lived off of that, extracted some of that money. So the question is, what kind of economy do we have after Wall Street? We can't simply have a service economy, because if we simply take in each other's laundry, we can't sustain a reasonable standard of living. The question of this particular project, though, is more complicated than you suggested, because the sticking point was twofold. One, that the borough president, Ruben Diaz, wanted a slush fund. The sticking point was not the living wage per se. It was the slush fund for Ruben Diaz, and Diaz's demand that hiring be done through his operation, through his political operation. Secondly, the question is, who did the living wage apply to? Did it apply to people building, or did it apply to people who were going to be running the stores where the retail workers come in?
It was going to apply to the retail workers.
It was going to apply. This was an unusual provision, because then what you're saying is people in this development have to pay higher wages, perhaps, likely, than other competitors. But on the underlying point, I think you're right. If you get city subsidies, complications are going to come with it. The trouble with that argument, however, is that part of the reason people need subsidies to do things in New York is because costs in New York are so high. And costs are so high in New York because New York is an intensely politicized place. It's very hard to do anything in New York without greasing the skids, without paying people off, without going through an extensive land review process, without making kind donations to members of the city council, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an enormously difficult place. Now, having said that, many of the subsidies that the city provides, for instance, Bloomberg's nearly $1 billion in subsidies, and city and state, I should add, not just Bloomberg, for Atlantic Yards, is very hard to defend. It would be much better to have the city not subsidize development, to have the city be less expensive, less intrusive, less regulated, less corporatist, less statist, and not get into these fights after all. But if you go this way, I agree, there's a logic to this.
Jeff, is it a fair question to ask in terms of the Kingsbridge Armory, is no job better than a job that would have paid less?
I don't think that's the frame, by the way. And I also want to correct something. There was no idea of a slush fund for Ruben Diaz or anything. I want to really very quickly go through a narrative, because I was involved there. And actually, the community group, the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, was involved there 13 years, many years before I was involved. And they had a vision, actually, of a mixed-use development, commercial, schools, large amounts of community space. And they brought everyone on board for that, and we joined that effort, actually. And the coalition that was created, the Kingsbridge Armory Redevelopment Alliance, brought the developer, brought the project forward. We got the mayor to agree to issue an RFP, and in that RFP process, which we were the request for proposal, we entered, introduced ideas of like living wage as a goal, no harm to local businesses as a part of it, ideas about schools and so forth. All of those were denied by the developer that was then chosen. We also made sure that it would be built union. It was actually the borough president at that time, Carry On, didn't want to build it union, and we were involved in making sure it was built union. And then we wanted to negotiate with the developer about living wages because he was receiving all those subsidies. And that really became the one and key issue in this whole fight. And it's really, I would argue, about the destruction of the jobs. It's really Bloomberg and the developer who decided to destroy those jobs. And by the way, the 1,200 full-time equivalents. It's a lot of part-time jobs. Those jobs are generally minimum wage jobs, a little above minimum wage, a lot of part-time work, and so forth. But the developer actually began to indicate or hint that they would be willing to agree to at least negotiate over living wages. They've agreed to living wages out in California. Bloomberg clearly said no. And you know, if you want to say who destroyed those jobs, it was Bloomberg. The point about what kind of jobs we want, I think that's really crucial. Retail wholesale department store unions involved in a lot of different fights about low-wage work and retail work. I mean, retail is one of the growing industries in the United States. In terms of the next 10 years, there'll be the amount of jobs produced will be retail sales clerks will be one of the largest numbers of jobs created. They will be low-wage jobs. We have, and all the service economy, as Fred points out, is tremendously low wage. Of the 30 jobs being produced over the next 10 years, half of them, 15 of them, are low wage. And 22 of them don't even require college education. And there's incredible pressure downwards on the wages and benefits of these jobs. So we have to figure out, that's the reality that we're confronting. And we have to figure out how to deal with at least that piece of the reality. I'm not going to deal with what other jobs can be created. So we have to deal with wage theft, because one big part of retail in New York State and throughout is that people are working at sub-minimum jobs. Wage theft is tremendous. So we have to at least, if you're going to push people up, you have to at least establish a floor. You can't have no floor. So we're involved in wage theft issues all the time. You have to deal with contracts and negotiate. But do you try to negotiate a contract in an environment where the other side has acquired all the power and has the ability to threaten and so forth? So, but we have to have, some unionization is an important piece of that. And we have to have the support of legislation, of mandates, especially in subsidized projects, where if you have subsidies flowing in, you have to have some mandate on wage standards. If we want to push this floor up, and that's what creates a good economic environment, vibrant economic environment in our neighborhoods, where people have some money and they'll spend it in those neighborhoods. And you won't, so that's really, really important. That's what this whole fight was about.
Stephanie, you've looked at these laws around the country. Are they deleterious to the economy? Do they push down the economy? Do they keep jobs away?
Yeah. What's interesting is I first started studying living wage ordinances in Los Angeles in the mid-90s, where we were asked by the Los Angeles City Council to present some information about what we expected would happen should the city pass a living wage ordinance. And in that day, at that time, really people didn't know a lot about these ordinances. Most of the studies were speculative, just trying to guess at what would happen. 15 years later, we actually have a handful of studies that actually have looked at the ordinances, have gone in, we've gone in and we've interviewed workers, we've interviewed employers, we've interviewed city officials, and we've said what is the impact. And what's interesting is none of those dire predictions have come true, and actually some of the same employers who said, I'll leave the city or I'll drop my contract, still hold those contracts today. What we found is that for the most part, the living wage ordinances have a very small financial impact on the employer. On average, less than 1% of their total operating costs go to paying for the living wage. Same with city budgets. They've had a very small negligible effect on city budgets. On the other hand, they've had a pretty significant impact on some of the workers. They're not changing people's lives. They're not making people rich. They're not, we're talking about going to $10 an hour, which is just to meet the federal poverty line. So we're not talking about a rags to riches wage. But when you interview workers about that raise, they'll say, I'm able to drop my third job, or I'm able to pay off electricity bill, I'm able to buy a computer, these kinds of things that really make a big difference in people's lives. So what's interesting is we find that the costs of the living wage are very dispersed, so no one actually feels them very strongly, but the benefits are quite concentrated into the hands of the workers that have been really struggling to make it on a very, low minimum wage.
Jump in on this. Fred, do you believe that this is a minimal impact? I mean, what is?
I don't think that's the issue. The issue is if we look at New York is a city with a declining middle class. It has an hourglass social structure, an hourglass economy. Those costs, such as they are, get pushed up to the middle class. The wealthy can bear them quite well in a city that runs along the lines of the financial industry. It's the middle class that ends up paying for rent control, rent subsidies, wage subsidies. They're the ones who leave New York. And New York has experienced the largest outmigration of middle class people, city and state, of any place in the United States. So I think what was just described, I think you're accurate. What described is accurate. It does help people, but it doesn't help people in the long run because it doesn't allow for a job ladder. It doesn't allow people to move up the middle class rungs of the ladder. And that's part of the reason why New York is such an unequal, dysfunctional place in terms of social structure. Historically, the city was a place where people could rise through society. It's not true anymore. And part of the reason it's not true is that the costs are simply too great.
One of the reasons people were able to rise is because people worked in union jobs and they had benefits and they were able to
long before
they were able to make
union. I don't think union jobs are the issue one way or the other. I think the overall cost.
It was for my family.
No. It was my grandfather was part of the ILGWU. Individual cases. I'm not talking about individual cases. I'm talking about an economy. What makes for a successful economy? You mentioned Los Angeles. Los Angeles has 14.5% unemployment. The project where this was to be employed, Broad Street, has not been built. In other words, you have an irony. Policies that may be well-intentioned and designed to help poor people end up producing cities that stagnate economically.
Fred.
Not because they've helped people, but because the process becomes intensely politicized. Start with the beginning here. Why was related the developer? Well, Steve Ross is a close friend of Mayor Bloomberg. So this was politicized from the get-go. So it's hard to argue. It's hard to argue.
Development is politicized at that kind of a level.
There's more.
Right?
There's more and there's less. In New York, it's more.
Fred,
Yeah.
I don't want to talk, you're talking, I think you're really changing the nature of the discussion or the debate. The fact of the matter is, if you create stable jobs, even the low-wage jobs, if you begin to stabilize them, if you provide enough money for the family so they're not working 2 or 3 jobs, you begin to create the conditions for what you would want to see. A middle-class family, stable families, ability to have some discretionary funds, a better environment, a more stable environment. That has to be done. The fact of the matter is that this economy, not only in New York State, but throughout this country, is now producing these types of jobs. And they're going to be producing these types of jobs for the next 10 years. Now, we're not going to go like that and transform it into a different type of economy or different types of jobs, not in the space we have. We have to work with what we got. And one way of working we have is we raise these standards. That's one piece of it. It's not the whole piece of it. It's one piece of it. So,
and I would agree completely that, especially in terms of looking at legislature and looking at legislation and what role we play as a legislative body in the city of New York, and this will go across with Congress and any other legislative body, is, what kind of a city do we want to live in? Do we want to, and what kind of a tone do we want to set in terms of what kind of business we want to see in the city? And so when we do have expectations that you're going to provide people somewhat of a quality job that is going to at least give you allow you the bare minimum to provide for your families, that's a message that I want to be a part of. That's kind of legislation that I want to be able to sponsor and support, because that again is sending a message about what kind of a city we want to live in. Many of us, and I still to this day don't want to see a Walmart in New York City because of what their business practices represent. It represents very much about no benefits. Basically, you come in and now they're dealing with healthcare because of the pressure has been so intense. But basically, they would basically give people an application for public assistance. That was their kind of definition of what providing healthcare was. Well, I mean, so my thing, that's I think the message that many of us in sponsoring legislation of this type, those of us that are more progressive in our thinking, is to say that, well, yes, government has a role to play in terms of setting the tone and of how the discussion is going to be in the city and what kind of business practices we want to see in the city. Also, we're talking about public monies that are being invested. There has to be a return on that investment. It's really interesting that at a national level, when we talk about people that live in public housing, there's a mandate. Because you're in public housing, you have to do community service. When there was that whole discussion in terms of having people that were receiving public assistance, having to provide some level of give back in terms of the program here in the Department of Parks, or whether you were receiving public assistance, you had to, give service. There's a two-tiered system in terms of what the expectations are of people that are poor and then those that are wealthier. And people that are wealthy and businesses and corporations somehow feel that they can get away, with treating people poorly or not providing a decent pay. And that's not acceptable, and it shouldn't be acceptable to anyone.
And I would just add in terms of costs, what we were trying to do at Kingsbridge and what we're trying to do with living wage, the cost should be borne by the developer or the retailer. Retailers are called, there's a really good article, 2000, Lynn Duggan, who wrote about parasitic industry. Retail in many ways is a parasitic industry, right? You can go, when workers go into a retail to get a job, they have programs which tell you, well, how much benefit will this worker receive so that we don't have to provide health benefits and so forth. So what we're really saying is this isn't right. Either you bear the cost of your workforce, you make it a sustaining workforce, right? Or you go out of business.
I think what's interesting too is that these questions, it's not just a New York question, because this model of a bad job versus a low wage job is faced by workers around the world. And actually, I've been working with living wage campaigns in England and Canada, Japan, and Asia, other parts of Asia, where people are facing actually some of the same retailers. These same retailers that have merged and have so much power that they can set the terms of the labor market, they can set the terms of the local economy. They can go to an economy, whether it's New York or Chicago or Bangkok, and say, we want subsidies or we're leaving. And if they have that kind of power against a New York City Council, then think of the kind of power they have against an individual worker. There's no way that individual worker is going to be able to negotiate up a higher wage against a power like that. So the retail industry it's a global industry, and they're shaping the nature of political economies in cities. And the only way that we can counter that is strong policy interventions that shape a different kind of labor market.
But the trouble with that is it's a losing game in the long run. No city in America intervenes more in labor markets. No city in America intervenes more in housing markets. We spend more on subsidized housing than all the rest of the United States combined, and we always have a housing shortage. My problem with this is not what it does in individual cases. My problem is the systemic effect. When you politicize an economy, the people who do best are those who are best politically connected. And sometimes that's Steve Ross at Related, who's because he's friend, and sometimes that's got to do with public sector unions because they have the greatest clout, whether it be at the city council or the state legislature. But the net effect of this is stagnation. It's not as if people look at New York, outside of New York, and say, "I want to be like New York. I want the income structure of New York or New York State." People are fleeing. People are voting with their feet as in response to these kinds of policies. Middle-class people.
We are not talking about, first of all, public sector unions here. We're talking about the private sector, which has, in effect, been deregulated, or all the controls that used to permit unionization have all disappeared, which helped create a middle class. And what we've seen over 40 years, actually, in the history of the American economy, is a deregulated economy. Well, lo and behold, what did we get?
Lo and behold, New York never deregulated.
It's not just New York, Fred. Look at the whole country.
No, but if regulation produces the beneficial effects you're suggesting, you'd think people would be copying the New York model. They're not. It doesn't work in the long run for the population. It works best for those who are best connected in the long run. That doesn't mean that the specifics of what you're saying are wrong, as I think the specifics of what you're saying are true. Individual people benefit from these practices. The overall economy, however, suffers.
The New York City has not done anything really, except for in a very minor way, about wage standards. Other places have. They just haven't done it, and it's highly resisted now. So that aspect has not been done. You're talking about other issues, and I don't think play a role in the living wage debate.
But Jeff, there are two things I want to pick up. One, the public sector unions played a major, as you know, were part of this coalition. They played an important role in this. It was their clout, which was very important.
Fred, I want to stop because I don't want to get into the ins and outs, but you're wrong. I just will say one thing: you're wrong. Jeff, I was there from. I don't want to get into the ins and outs. But you're wrong.
We're going to have to disagree on this.
You weren't there. So.
I know, you're right, I wasn't there. But I talked to people in those unions, and they described what they thought their role was. But let's go back to Diaz for a second. You said that Diaz didn't ask for a slush fund. But numerous people described conversations with Diaz. This is the borough president of the Bronx, asking for just that, asking that all hiring be done through his office.
Diaz took on this fight. And I admire him for that, right? Because he took on this fight knowing full well that he was going to bear a lot of criticism, right? And I worked with him. I was on the negotiating committee with him that helped craft the community benefits agreement that was a proposal that was submitted to Related. He realized the difficulties. It was not about a slush fund. BOEDC did, and Gateway have local hiring through that, and there was a proposal
the Bronx overall economic development
in the proposal about Kingsbridge that BOEDC would be involved again. This is not at all about the slush fund. It was a lot about impact upon local business. It was all about, I would argue, in all the discussions about living wages. And it was about trying to maximize construction jobs as well for the local folks and local hiring. And we had created these proposals about local hiring to impact folks in the neighborhood. What you're really forgetting is, in your analysis, is the particulars of this particular campaign, because I think people have a tendency to go beyond the particulars and generalize. But this particular was shaped to such a large extent by local community people, by the churches, and by us, because we were involved in this thing for 5 years. And whoever thought that this was going to end that way? Our idea was, the Armory is an incredible building. You walk up to it, it's incredible. No, I'm just saying.
No, I know,
and
that was
one of my
motivations.
My motivations of getting involved about this space. This was an incredible space.
It is.
And the idea of, and to make it meaningful for the community and for the workers, that was the thrust of all this.
If I can just say, because I have a real issue when terms are thrown out there like slush fund. When we are dealing with communities of color that have been seriously disenfranchised and disinvested, when a representative is there to advocate in the best interest of their community to try to get benefits that are going to benefit people that have been seriously disenfranchised and disinvested from communities, suddenly that's considered to be kind of like patronage or a slush fund or whatever. I don't want to entertain that idea. I think that what we have to look at as elected officials, we have a responsibility, particularly me and others, that we represent communities that are poor, communities that really have large unemployment rates, that have jobs, a lot of jobs that sometimes they don't provide benefits. And we have to advocate that development projects that are coming into our communities, that are using public land, that are getting public subsidies, which is our money, it's everybody's money. Everybody's money is being invested. These are the subsidies and givebacks that people are giving. To me, I don't understand how it's so far-fetched or really unreasonable for us to expect that community is going to somehow benefit from those jobs. And if I want to see a development project come into my community, I want to fight, to the teeth to make sure that those jobs are coming to my constituents. So if that is what Mr. Diaz was fighting for, then you know what? Then he's doing what he is supposed to be doing, fighting to ensure that those jobs are going to his community, the community in which this project is being built.
So
that's critical.
So government should allocate work.
No, that there be good jobs. It wasn't about allocating work. It was about making sure that this development, this $300 million project that was coming into this community, in the heart of the community, it's not just...
it's a great building.
Not just a building, it's in the heart of the community, of a neighborhood, would produce good jobs. And, to throw out, ideas like slush funds and that is just, I think what Melissa said, is just totally inaccurate and wrong and, fails to understand what was going on. It was a fight about making people live a little better.
And the other thing is that I think what you're speaking to is,
and those things are mutually exclusive.
This whole idea also when we talk about development and really having it be community-based, let the community envision what they want to see, and then we have to really support that vision. Here, it was very clearly indicated that living wage was something that was critically important to the residents of the community. The coalition was extensive, it was broad, it represented a cross-section of sectors, and that is what people are clamoring for. And so this concept of any job is a good job, so deal with it, and that was the message that the mayor was sending, I think is really the wrong message. And it really troubles me that recently, we now have a mayor who is saying that he doesn't even think that there should be a minimum wage, and that basically the market can take care of itself. That's really problematic, and that is not exactly what, we should be entertaining.
Bloomberg is not a good advertisement for the free market.
Well,
what other cities have, besides LA, have living wage agreements in place?
Well, there are about over 150 cities and counties that have living wage ordinances in place, and those include, various types. Some apply to city contracting, some cover direct city employees, some cover economic development, some apply to universities. So it's pretty widespread.
I'm sorry, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting about this movement is this modern living wage movement really blossomed starting in 1994 in Baltimore, where residents there felt they had been subsidizing what's called the Inner Harbor in Baltimore. It's a downtown tourist zone with restaurants and retail. And their city leaders had kept saying, let's give all these subsidies, build up this harbor, it'll be good for Baltimore residents. And these Baltimore residents were getting these minimum wage jobs and still in poverty. They were still going to food pantries. They were still not earning enough just to pay their basic costs. And they went to their churches and they went to the unions and said, we're not covering our costs. And it was that the idea really came out of that, saying, this is a city project where the city is investing in tourism and building the city. We have a responsibility to make these living wage jobs.
And how is Baltimore doing today?
Well, it's not a solution. Like, that's the problem. It didn't go far enough. Baltimore said we don't have enough capacity to legislate higher wages in all these areas. So they only passed it for city contracts. It doesn't cover enough workers. So cities have been fighting for the right to extend the living wage to other sectors, particularly to retail, where lots of the jobs are.
Is it trying to extend it to areas which are not publicly subsidized, or is the public subsidy the key leverage point?
So there's certain cities, San Francisco, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, that now have citywide minimum wage laws, such as Washington, D.C. So in certain cities, depending on the state laws, the cities themselves have a citywide minimum wage. New Orleans actually tried to pass such a citywide minimum wage and was overturned by the state Supreme Court. And you have to like what impact could have that made for people to have that little bit of higher wage in terms of, just making their ends meet. So we haven't had enough places, but San Francisco is doing perfectly well with a citywide minimum wage. It's doing quite well. It's a model for other cities.
My problem with what you're saying is San Francisco lives off Silicon Valley. It's a home for trust funds, for trust fund babies. It has virtually no economy anymore. The banks have left. Of the 100 largest businesses in the Bay Area, exactly 3 are based in San Francisco. It's an adult playland. It's not a real economy anymore. And as long as
that's a bit of a cartoon vision of San Francisco.
Have you been to San Francisco?
Yes,
recently?
I have.
Oh, tell me what the economy is other than tourism.
As engineers, architects, banks
who don't work there. The economy is outside the city. It's a wonderful play zone, but it's not. It has no economy.
Fred, we have to deal with the economy as it is. Unions represent are creatures of workers, right? In reality, and we confront the realities. In retail, you confront a certain reality. You have to deal with that reality, and it's not just in New York City. It's throughout this country that people are trying to deal with. And on top of, there are larger economic issues about the nature of the American economy, which probably requires a lot of government intervention. But this is not the frame of this discussion, where you want to make it that. But in terms of living wage, and in New York City and in other cities and throughout the world where low-wage workers are confronting the realities, particularly in retail, we have to figure out ways how to push that wages up. And if we want to create some middle class out of that, we have to do all these things that I've said.
Let me take a question. Tell us your name and your campus, please. Speak up.
My name is Sherelle Moore, and I go to John Jay College. My question here is for Congresswoman Mark-Viverito.
Congressman, no.
I'm sorry. Bump me up a couple of notches. I'll take it.
Sorry. You mentioned that Walmart is a large franchise that you would not like to see in New York. And they also look to find out the federal poverty level so they could keep people under the threshold. Do you think that because the federal poverty level is public knowledge that they are able to become a monopoly and keep people underneath the threshold for making more money and becoming more successful or climbing up the ladder in success in the organization such as that?
Well, that's a very loaded question, and it's a very complicated issue in general. Walmart is a huge multinational corporation, and it's really about making as much money as possible at the expense of its workers, and that's really been their business model and their business practice. And so there has been, and the unions have been really critical in this. They've really organized, and workers have been organizing to try to really have them change that business model and that perspective. And there's been success in that to a certain extent, but still, I think that there's concerns there that obviously that there's very little upward mobility. There's very little in terms of benefits, real substantial benefits and pay that's helpful to the workers to help them really move to that next level. But again, I believe, and I'm a very strong believer in organizing in general, and have people getting involved and putting pressure on these business practices as a way of trying to improve work conditions, also quality of life in our communities. We've got to get involved and hold our legislators accountable. But I don't know if any of the other panelists want to speak to that, but obviously they have had a problematic business practice, and that has to change. And that's not the kind of business practice that me as a legislator representing constituents in the city of New York would like to see here.
Oh, no, go ahead.
There's one quick thing is a lot of people might say that we need Walmart in low-income communities because low-income shoppers rely on Walmart. Well, interestingly, we did some research that looked at, well, what would happen if Walmart started paying the $10 an hour across the country? What would be the impact on consumers? The average consumer at Walmart would actually pay a total of, if the entire cost of the wage was passed on to the consumer and none to Walmart, it'd be about $7 a year. $7 a year in increased costs to cover the wage increase.
I think the problem with using Walmart is Walmart was engaged in conscious cost shifting. Their strategy was to put costs onto the public budget. And so that wasn't defensible. And you had a wide range of people who were very critical of Walmart for just that reason. But Walmart was also then too easily demonized. Think about the Bronx. Forget about Walmart. Think about the Bronx. The poverty rate in the Bronx is 45%. It's got the highest rate of unemployment in New York. The interventions in the Bronx labor market are extensive. When people came to to Borough President Diaz from Stella D'Oro and said, this factory is leaving, when a whole number of factories came to Diaz and said, we're leaving, private sector factories, he didn't care. There was no payoff in it for him.
Well, excuse me. No, that's really, the borough president has no authority. I mean, has no authority over Stella D'Oro and ability to keep it here. Bloomberg had some authority because the city had actually given them tax advantages. But that's just...
But Jeffy didn't even call them. He made no contact with them whatsoever.
This was a strike that was going on
for 18...
Yeah, for a while.
Off and on.
Right.
No, it was a strike that went on. They only went back because the board ordered it back and because Stella D'Oro had violated the law. And Diaz or not, and Diaz did what he could as borough president, but this is not about Diaz or not. I don't understand even why he's brought in or talked about Stella D'Oro. Stella D'Oro is an example of the problem in the American economy with manufacturing. We have had that problem. I mean, I was out in Chicago when I was in Madison. I used to sail on the lakes. I used to go up Calumet River, and I used to see the closed mills. I was at Chicago when Chicago was turning from an industrial city into something else, a luxury city, as you would call it, probably.
No, I wouldn't call Chicago
well,
a
anyway,
luxury city.
But the mills have disappeared. The mills, manufacturing has disappeared in New York City to a large extent. We didn't, as a city, as a country, did not do, in fact, if anything, we encouraged manufacturing to leave this country. That's what we did. That's the larger, macroeconomic issues that confront us. And we have to figure that out. But again, we're confronted with a tremendous growth of low-wage work. Particularly Walmart is Walmart is the largest employer. It's not just demonized. It's the largest employer in the United States. When I was growing up, General Motors was the largest employer. It was a good job. That was the model. 1 out of 6 workers worked in automobile or some. That was the ideal. Totally unionized. We now have the largest employer, non-union, viciously anti-union, a major wage violator, pays below, contracts, deals with contractors to pay below the minimum wage. That's the problem. We've created, and it's a parasitic industry. As you know, it goes out and looks for the public trough to feed off of. It can't sustain its workforce, so it sends its workforce for public benefits. That's the problem. We have to deal with it. There are myriad ways we have to deal with it. One of the ways we're dealing with it, and it's only one, is the living wage way.
Through publicly subsidized.
In public subsidy.
Exactly.
Yes.
My name is Antonio Mashev Jr. I attend Queens College. And Melissa Mark-Viverito has wonderfully expressed that economic development projects need to push for a living wage through legislation. My question is, won't increasing the minimum wage to $10, for instance, as you mentioned, cause prices to rise as well and have city dwellers caught up in a vicious cycle?
Well, I think Anne has talked about that extensively. Anne, did I get your name?
Stephanie.
I'm sorry,
That's
Stephanie.
fine.
I don't know where I got Anne from. Stephanie had talked about that really extensively, with regards to the fact, like taking as Walmart as an example, that if you do raise what you pay workers, that it's not going to really be a cost shifted to, or if it is, it's a minimal cost shift. So I think, again, my message is that I think government has a really important role to play in setting the tone of what we expect to see and how we want business conducted. And what we're doing in New York City, hopefully is something that obviously other municipalities have modeled, and we should be following their lead when it comes to this. But I don't think, and I don't agree with the premise that it would be some sort of a cost that would be shifted to the individual people that live in the city. But you want to speak to that, Stephanie?
Yeah, and it's actually, it's interesting because a lot of newspaper op-eds and quotes might say that it could cause prices to rise, but that's actually not something that economists say. Even economists who oppose the minimum wage don't suggest that it leads to inflation.
Retail is one of those industries that can't be outsourced, although the development of retail shopping on the web is undercutting that argument. But it's not the kind of, there's not a Bangalore or a Manila for you can't go there in order to get a cheaper price on what you want to purchase.
Bob, you wouldn't know from the way we're talking that manufacturing as a percentage of the gross domestic product is the same today as it was in 1970. The change is the number of people producing the same value of goods. It's not that manufacturing has disappeared. The value of manufacturing as a percentage of the economy has remained roughly constant.
But we're talking about about jobs.
But that's right.
The jobs aren't there.
So then the question is, we move out of a manufacturing economy and we move into a service economy. How do we do that? We've had this model which you've described in these many cities, but I don't know of any success stories. Los Angeles, you mentioned Los Angeles. Los Angeles has pushed very hard the justice for janitors, et cetera, et cetera. Los Angeles is bankrupt. It's in terrible shape. It's falling apart. And the politicization I talked about is even more is almost as manifest there as it is here.
What city is not?
Los Angeles.
What city is not bankrupt?
Right.
No, but I don't think. Can I just speak to what you're saying? I think the success lies in what Stephanie said before, that these companies that scream and shout that if they do not get these subsidies, or if they have to pay that minimum wage or that living wage, that they're going to be able to leave the city. And the fact that they're still there providing jobs and still there doing business means, in fact, that it's successful. That, to me, means it's successful.
Councilwoman, it's not what we're speaking to.
Well, that's the issue we're talking about.
That's the issue you're talking about. That's not what we were just talking about.
And whether it impacts business practices.
That's what you're talking about. It's not what we were just talking about a second ago.
Okay.
Think about that. If I ask the students, what parts of the country have done well in this devastating downturn? Are there any sections? Well, yeah,
but that's not the issue we're discussing. That's not the thing.
Excuse me. That was the question Stephanie raised.
That's not the question we're discussing here.
As you like it. I haven't reached the elevated level of a council member yet.
Let's keep it calm.
There's a funnel of states. Places like we don't think of as being Boise, Des Moines, Austin, Houston, Dallas. They're booming. What they have, unlike Detroit, they weren't tamped down. They weren't undercut by hyper-unionization, by excessive work rules. And it's unfortunate that you mentioned Detroit, because the argument on the low end for unionization is something I'm sympathetic to. But at the higher end, it wasn't just that management of General Motors was terrible. It was, or Government Motors as it's now called. But it was also the rigidity of the work rules that made the cost of putting out a GM car so much higher than putting out a non-union Toyota.
Well, how much of that was over on the cost of health care that was imposed upon, arguably, I don't want to go there, but arguably the health care linked to the employers compared to our competitors overseas don't have.
Toyota plants in America, I'm talking about not Toyota plants abroad, Toyota plants in America paid similar, provided similar kind of health care benefits.
Let me go to another question. We can discuss the universe, but we'll get lost.
Yes. Hi, my name is Shamila Williams. I'm from Brooklyn College, and if I was following the discussion properly, it was stated that about 1,200 jobs paying a living wage would have been created, and I kept hearing Mr. Professor Siegel state that this would cause, if I follow the discussion properly, will cause a stagnation in the middle class, and as well as a fleeing of the middle class. And I want to know, how is that possible when, if you really think about it, like that 1,200 people probably represent a family in which maybe 3 other people are dependent on them, which would be about 4,800 people that you're giving a living wage to and helping to support, as opposed to that maximum 4,800 people being dependent on subsidies from the city, which would affect the middle class because they would have to pay a higher tax, and which would cause them maybe to flee. So I really would like it if you could expound upon your theory that this creating of a minimum living wage would cause the fleeing of a middle class and the stagnation of our city.
Yeah, I didn't argue that was the case. What I argued was that the specifics were probably not terribly consequential. I think what Stephanie said is accurate. I don't think that the narrow microeconomic effects would be tremendously important. My problem was the larger process whereby this game was played out, the intense politicization of all sorts of decisions. That is enormously costly. And as for the flight of the middle class, it's in the numbers. New York City and state has lost 1 million middle-class people since 2000, the largest middle-class outmigration in the United States. This is not something that, I don't think this is a function of the specifics of paying a living wage on this project. I wasn't opposed to that. And my point about the project is that, yes, I think the proponents of the project had a good point. If Jeffrey Ross at Related was getting these subsidies, sorry?
Stephen Ross.
Stephen Ross, sorry.
Right.
Who's Jeffrey Ross? Oh, he's the comedian. It was getting these subsidies. Yeah, other people have the same right. They have the right to put their hand out as well. The issue in New York is that New York works very well for a fairly small segment of the population. But it doesn't work well for those people aspiring to move into the middle class. I don't even, and these jobs, even in the best of conditions, might become a platform for the middle class, but they themselves are not middle class jobs. That next rung, we're missing, in other words, that next rung of jobs.
As we've said, and I've said several times now, this is one aspect of trying to deal with this problem of low-wage work and moving people into the middle class, into stable jobs, decent families. This is one part of it. It's not the end-all, be-all. That's only one part of it. There's a whole bunch of other things we need to do. Some of them I might agree with you.
Yes, yes, sir.
My name is Richard Hockhauser from Queens College. My question is, I understand it seems to be the proponents of the legislation seem to be focusing on, with all due respect, a lot of moral and ethical issues with it, meaning of having so many low-wage workers. But rather, it seemed to be in the beginning of the discussion, the focus was on how are we going to fix the current economic, situation that the country is in. Now, from what I understand, the biggest problem of this economy is, in fact, the middle class problem. The middle class has been decimated, and if right now we're helping out the low wage workers, seemingly with a moral and ethical obligation, but we're talking about strictly from an economic sense. It would seem that we should be focusing more on the middle class. I understand $10 an hour we're trying to say is middle class. However, I think that it's still going to remain the low wage workers. They're not really the solution to the fixing the economic problem.
I'm not sure that I understand or I'm supposed to talk this way, right? that the middle class is suffering the most because the unemployment rates and job losses are highest among low-wage workers and workers with the lowest amount of education. So I'm not quite sure about that statistic. I think that the challenge is that that it's true. We're not solving the recession through the living wage. We're not solving Los Angeles budget crisis through the living wage. The living wage is a small attempt to try and reverse trends that have been going on for 20 and 30 years among low-wage workers. And what I was saying earlier about in Baltimore was that workers felt like they had been blocked at the federal level, they've been blocked at the state level, they've lost all political voice. They only have political voice at best at the city council level, where they can actually go and talk to their city council member. They have no access at other levels. So I understand, we don't want corrupt politics, but we need access to the political arena, and that's the only access workers have. They don't have access through their employers. They're denied forming unions. They're denied, all these other avenues to making a better life. I think that solving the general recession, solving general unemployment is going to take a much bolder approach. We need to double the number of teachers we have in the schools. We need to double the number of healthcare workers we have. We need to put people to work in the low wage in construction, in retrofitting homes for green construction. Massive jobs programs that will help rebuild the economy. The living wage is only one aspect of that. It's just saying, as we did in the recession, as we did in the Great Depression, we said, we're going to establish the federal minimum wage in 1938 so that when we do have job growth, it'll be at a higher standard. We're setting the rules of the game for a new kind of labor market so we can rebuild on that foundation. And that's what we're saying now. Let's raise that level back to a minimum wage should be a living wage so you can meet the federal poverty line. When we can create jobs, we create them on top of that standard.
I just want to point out to you that numerically you got it wrong. Blue-collar men are the biggest losers. With lower middle class jobs, they're far and away the biggest losers in this economic downturn. At the lower end of the labor market, it's a lot of churning. There are a lot of jobs lost, but there are a lot of jobs gained. That's number one. Number two, you said double the number of teachers. We've doubled the number of teachers. We've tripled school spending over the last 40 years. And the results don't look very promising. The trouble with the idea that this is like the Great Depression and we can redo is the Great Depression didn't have all the social programs, all the economic costs that came subsequently. When the Great Depression began, the federal government was 3% of the gross domestic product. Today it's 23% of the GDP, and under Obama it's moving up. So this is a different world. We're drowning in debt. We're deeply, deeply in debt. The city under Bloomberg, Bloomberg gets kid gloves coverage from the newspapers. He's built up enormous debts. During the boom time, when the money was coming in, when the sky was raining gold, and he was holding a tuba in his hands, right, he sent it out faster than it came in. And we're going to be paying for that. We're going to be paying for that down the road. Sorry. And just the last thing on this. Let me stop.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Sure. My name is Andrea Canepa from John Jay College, and my question is for the supporters of the bill. The idea of the added cost of the living wage, canceling out the subsidies received by the developers in the first place, has been toyed around a bit, and I wanted to know if there's any accuracy to that. What is the relation between the added cost of having a provision such as living wage? How would that impact the actual amount of subsidies that developers receive?
And is the subsidy really a leverage that allows the city to kind of get in there and add this living wage mandate?
I've spoken quite a bit.
Right, and I would say the same. I mean, the subsidy is a point of entry into this living wage debate and living wage legislation.
I'm not sure,
what the other part of the first part of the question.
Would the amount of the living wage
would it actually offset? Would the tax revenue generated by a higher wage offset this? I'm not sure anybody's done offset the.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we know the amounts of this.
We got about 5 minutes left. I want to try to get another question or two in. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Jocelyn Janot. I attend Lehman College, and my question is for Professor Siegel. I'm curious. You mentioned that these aren't the types of solutions that the professors and the councilwoman have mentioned aren't great solutions for a middle class. What are some solutions that you have?
Briefly, believe it or not.
Yeah, we want to.
We have to have a future after finance. Finance is going to shrink as a percentage of the New York City and New York State economy. So when I look around, I say, what new industries are developing in New York? There's only one that I know of any consequence, and that's video gamers. And we're not going to build an economy around people who do programming for video games. If we don't reduce costs in New York, we can't reproduce our manufacturing base. One of the things that's missing in New York, it's not the old-fashioned, people forget what manufacturing was in New York. Manufacturing in Brooklyn meant breweries. It meant all sorts of food processing. One of LA's advantages for many years is it had food processing.
It meant shipbuilding. It meant.
Oh no! I'm just thinking. Right. I know we're not. Right. Shipbuilding is not coming back, but food processing could come back. People want to be close. They want to be. You're near ethnic markets. You can't do that in New York because everything costs. Power costs too much. Taxes are too high. Regulations are too onerous. So if you want another economy, if we're not going to just sort of muddle through a long downturn, and we could have a missing decade like Canada had and Japan had in the 1990s. This 2008 to 2018 can end up being the lost decade for New York. We had a lost decade in New York essentially from 1972 to 1982. It wasn't pretty. You have to adjust costs. I don't think what we're talking about here, though, is a major contributor to to the costs. I think the overall process, however, that produced this outcome is a major contributor to the cost. That's what I was trying to get at, the politicization of decision making. And having a billionaire mayor, that produces a certain distorted sense of what things are worth.
Can I go to, yes, tell us.
Yes, good evening. Gene Velasquez from John Jay College. My question is for Professor Siegel. You stated numerous times that one of the downturns of economic development is that it becomes too politicized. And I want to move on to something that Councilmember Melissa stated, which is, as a legislator, she feels a moral obligation to help her constituents. My question is, what is wrong with elected officials trying to represent their constituents?
Absolutely nothing. Assuming that the legislators are in some sense broadly representative of the city. I point out to you that in most districts, most councilmanic and legislative districts, 6, 7, 8% of the total number of voters comes out. There's been a collapse of political participation in the city, a sense that politics are pointless. You win the Democratic primary with a tiny vote, there is no general election. The current controller and our public advocate got elected with a whopping 9% of the votes of all New Yorkers. Between this last mayoral election and mayoral election in 1994, we lost 800,000 voters.
Let me just, because I have less than 30 seconds,
sorry.
I'm going to give you, since you're a sponsor of the bill, give us a last-minute pitch for the bill, and how do you think it's going to run? You do have the mayor's opposition. How do you see it playing out?
We believe very strongly there's a large number that are supporting this. We believe we've built a broad-based coalition that is, what we as the city council sponsors are doing is that it's reflective, of what people in the city want to see. And it's really, again, setting a tone about the kind of business practices we want to see. We have that responsibility, and I think that we're going to be able to pass this very overwhelmingly.
Pardon me, I never miss deadline. I got the goodbye sign. Thank you all. We'll see you next time on CUNY Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.